Welcome to this week's episodes of Insights. During this week's show, we're going to be discussing two topics. The first one is the ongoing negotiations between the Armenian government and the Erdogan regime about the possibility of establishing relations between the two countries. And the second one is going to be the impact of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, especially if it gets worse, on Armenia, and specifically on the economy of Armenia, and obviously its politics. Let's start off with the first one, which is the negotiations with Turkey about establishing normalized relations. As I have said before, I'm quite skeptical of this thing. I think this will likely, it's a long road that leads to nowhere, exactly because the Turkish side has very little to gain by doing this. And I think this is most likely some drawn-out game that they're playing with us, which is going to lead to nothing. But for the purposes of this show, let's assume that these things are going to move forward and there's going to be relations, and that obviously leads into multiple things. Let's start looking at the impact of what it would mean to have normalized relations with Turkey. It's got multiple facets and aspects. And the first one is has to do with diplomatic relations, obviously, which essentially allows direct communication between both sides. For us, this is an absolute positive. There's nothing negative about this. And as I said before, I've heard Armenian diplomats complain about their inability to speak directly with Turkey. We don't need third parties to talk to our neighbors, no matter what we think of them. So in all aspects, this should be a good thing. The second one is obviously transportation. Anything that increases our access to the world or the world's access to us through multiple transportation systems. Right now, we can only essentially travel through 2 of our 4 neighbors, is a good thing. So again, I think that would be a win for us. The last one, which is the one that is probably the most important one, is open borders and what that means to our economy. We're going to be spending most of our time on this topic on the economic front. What would it mean to have open borders and open trade with Turkey? And what are the possibilities and what are the pitfalls? On the economic front, there's a great deal of symmetry between these two economies because given their size, they actually are involved in businesses that we're not involved in because of the economies of size. Whether it's light industry, there's a lot of trade already between Turkey and Armenia, mostly Turkish imports coming into Armenia. Whether they come through Georgia or directly through the border, it really makes a marginal amount of difference. If you look at the Turkish economy overall, it's sort of designed to be a light manufacturing or a cheap labor site for European businesses, sort of what Mexico is for the United States. Their industry, for the most part, is involved in importing lots of materials, processing them and exporting them. This is not Germany or China, where they have entire industrial sectors that feed off of each other. They're essentially an assembly point because of cheap labor. There are, however, countless areas where their economy is actually world competitive, and that's in tourism, in construction, and in exporting vegetables, fruits to the world. Those are the places where they can compete internationally. The most important thing for us, if we're ever going to have open borders, is to protect 2 categories of people, which are going to be our farmers, small producers, which because of the economies of scale are going to have a hard time competing with the massive scale that the Turkish industries operate in, especially in agribusiness, and our textile producers, because it is the one place that we actually have similar industries. The textile industry in Armenia is constantly growing. Those are the places that we need to watch out for and protect if we're going to have open borders. Last one, and not thought much about, is actually regulation of labor and immigration. The fact is that because of the continued devaluation of the lira and how poor the provinces in historic Armenia or in current-day Turkey are compared to Armenia itself, it's going to be much easier to earn higher salaries, especially in fields like construction, in Armenia than it is in Turkey. So we have to be very cognitive of how to limit, control, or regulate any labor that comes over, or not to allow it at all. And this is something that's going to accentuate over the next year or 2 as the economic and the lira depreciation continues And the lira is actually becoming, on its way to becoming really a fourth world currency, which is going to accentuate these imbalances. On closing on this topic, I think it's one thing that's important. There's this myth out there, and I think it's this what I call the frozen time in 1993, which is when the border itself closed. That if the border is open or if there's trade, Turkey is doing some great favor to Armenia. That's actually not the case. It would have been the case in 1993. It is no longer the case. These countries and their economies are not where they were 30 years ago. Opening borders will actually be beneficial to both sides. Trade will be beneficial to both sides. And realistically, the side that was probably benefit more would be the Turkish side, given how poor some of the provinces next to Armenia are, and whenever you open up trade possibilities for poor places, their incomes go up. So we need to get away from this myth that any kind of an opening is a favor to Armenia. It is something that should happen, but it is something that's holistic and is going to help both sides. Now let's move on to the second and frankly the more important issue, which is what's going on in the Ukraine-Russia border. I'm not going to get into the specifics of the details because everyone who's been following the news knows what's been happening there, and all the negotiations back and forth, threats, fear of war. We all know about that. But what we need to look at is what impact would this conflict have on us both economically and politically? And it's actually multiples, and the economic ones are frankly far more relevant to us. In the short run, any Russian incursions into Ukraine or any kind of a war will trigger a set of sanctions from the West. And even if it doesn't trigger sanctions, it's going to just an unstable political situation or a military situation is going to depreciate the ruble and make it worth less, ruble being the Russian currency. Now, Russia itself is one of our primary export markets. I think 25% of Armenia's exports go there. And when your export markets get poorer, they buy less from you. So that's obviously going to have a clear impact on us. Secondly, we get a lot of remittances from Russia, from laborers that go work there. And if the ruble is worth less, they'll be sending back less money, or the money that they send back has less value and less buying power. So that obviously is something that's going to impact us severely. Lastly, and the most importantly, is the threat by the West to kick Russia off what they call the SWIFT system. SWIFT is the banking setup that regulates all banking transactions. Now, for economic purposes, throwing any country off of SWIFT is nearly the declaration of war. And the only country that this has happened to was Iran, and it completely capsized their economy many years ago. However, this provides other opportunities, and it's not simply negatives, because if you are a Russian business and you can no longer carry out transactions from Russia, you're going to have to move to another country that is politically friendly to you, and establish there. And that's not just a qualifier. You need a country that has a functioning central bank, a stable currency, and a country that has good relations with the West. And there's frankly only one country that fits that qualifier, and that's Armenia. So if the Russian businesses or economy is kicked off of the SWIFT system, which I think would be a severe sanction, almost all of them are going to have to go establish themselves as businesses someplace else, even if it's just a legal entity, and do all their financial transactions, which is obviously going to create opportunities for our banking sector. However, our banking sector is very well run, very conservative, with a very good central bank, but it is of small scale. This is not, we're talking about a very undercapitalized banking system, as well run, as conservative as it is. So this is going to come with its opportunities, but it's also going to come with its challenges. As far as the labor migration part of this goes, any depreciation of the ruble is going to make it less and less worthwhile for people from Armenia to go to work in Russia, because even today, wages on many fronts, especially construction, are near Russian levels or slightly below. Any kind of a severe depreciation of the ruble is going to incentivize many of these people to come back, which actually will help us with our consistent labor shortage in the different sectors of the economy that we have. In concluding the economic parts of this impact of a conflict is we need to see this as an opportunity for Armenia to sort of become what Hong Kong was for communist China, when communist China was actually a communist country, which was its entree to the world. And it was something that worked for all sides. The West could trade with China via a third party, and everything went on. So I think, as with any set of circumstances, you need to look at the opportunities that are there and seize them, and this could be one of those opportunities. In conclusion, I think it's important for us to understand what this conflict between Ukraine and Russia is and what it isn't, because that has distinct impact on us geopolitically. What this is not about is about the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. Both sides know that is not going to happen, and most likely it's never going to happen. And in fact, any kind of a conflict between world powers over that issue is sort of the equivalent of multiple bald men fighting over a comb. It's just not something that is worth fighting over. I think what this is really about is two worlds clashing and two sets of ideas clashing. This is on the Western side, or on the American side, is this notion of a unilateral world that was run by the United States and her Western partners, that came about in the post-Cold War period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that is running headlong into the reality of today, which is that the world is a multipolar place. And that with the Western retreat in multiple places, the West no longer can impose its will in the peripheries of its areas of influence. On its core areas of influence, it can dominate, but when it comes to areas like the Middle East, the Caucasus, or Eastern Europe, there are limits to what it can do. Now, how this really impacts us directly is the understanding, and what has become clear is that the West no longer has the wherewithal or the political will to impose its will on our part of the world or other peripheral parts of the world which are not part of the core of Western interests. And what this means that for our purposes, we have to understand that when it comes to security, when it comes to geopolitics, and I want to be clear about this, it's not about economics and it's not about culture. The rest is going to play a less and less role in our part of the world, and we need to find our way without thinking that there's any Western powers that are ever going to come to our rescue if we are in troubled times. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.